Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lizzie, and I welcome you on behalf of Judiskt kultur i Sverige to the second part of our series talk, which we do in cooperation with Kulturhuset Stadsteatern. And this evening is also in cooperation with Bonniers Förlag and Dagens Nyheter. And we are very privileged to have here tonight a lawyer. He teaches international law in London, writer, and newly appointed PEN president in England, Philippe Sands, on the occasion of the publication, the Swedish publication of his book, Vägen till Nürnberg, and in English, East-West Street and the origins of genocide and crimes against humanity. And our moderator this evening is writer, journalist, and Swedish PEN president Elisabeth Åsbrink, whose celebrated book 1947 has a few meeting points with East-West Street. So I'm sure that the discussion between them will be very meaningful, and I wish you a very pleasant evening. Thank you very much.
All right, welcome. I must say the light is very sharp, so now I see you. As Johan and Lizzie just said, we'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions, but focused questions. So, message received clear, loud and clear, I think. Philippe Sands, welcome to Kulturhuset in Stockholm. I'll introduce Philippe, a lawyer, an award-winning writer, and you have to correct me now if I say something wrong, all right? You have a special interest in, I can't talk, environmental law.
I do.
Yeah. And laws governing crimes against humanity and genocide.
I do.
You've been working with cases involving Guantanamo, I understand?
I have.
This is going very well, isn't it?
She's really good. We know each other quite well.
Yeah, we do. And what I think is really interesting, but we probably won't have the time to discuss it, is your reaction to the Iraq War in 2003, where you actually were a really strong critic of the British decision to go to war, and of Tony Blair, who made the decision. But all this we'll have to save for another talk, I think. But I saw that Brexit is also one of your... a question where you have strong positions. And you even changed your Wikipedia information after it.
I did, indeed. I mean, the book, firstly, can I say it's incredibly nice to be back in Sweden and Stockholm. I know a number of friends in the audience, including from my other and primary world as an international lawyer, and it's absolutely lovely to see those friends here tonight. The book came out in England in May 2016, about 6 weeks before the Brexit referendum. I think, and all of you in this room will know what my position is on Brexit, so I don't have to speculate any more about my own views, but we can talk perhaps a little bit more later. But I think it's absolutely clear, and we'll get into this perhaps, that the subject of the book, which deals with a set of stories that are very rooted in the 1930s and the 1940s, has a connection with what is going on now in parts of Europe and parts of the world, which has given the book a particular resonance. It's sold in vastly more quantities than I think anyone could have imagined. And in part, that is an unhappy reflection of the state we currently find ourselves in, and perhaps we'll say a bit more about that. I should just say that if I had to choose between no Brexit and less book sales, and Brexit and more book sales, I would choose no Brexit.
But unfortunately, we are here, and it seems to be going through.
It's not over yet.
No, it's not. Is there a chance it won't happen? A legal?
Well, we could spend hours on
yeah,
this.
okay.
But what I'll say is this. I think it's very important, and the international lawyers will understand particularly what I'm saying. It's more important to look at substance than at form. And the big question at the end of the day is, will anything look that much different after March 2019 or December 2020? I think nothing much will change. It may be called something different, it may have a different form, but ways will be found essentially to limit the changes to the bare minimum. So I'm reasonably optimistic.
That's good to hear. That's great to hear. But I still have to get back to the Wikipedia. I mean, I know we all know what's important here. You changed your Wikipedia after the information there, after the Brexit decision, from Anglo-French lawyer to
Franco-British.
Yeah.
So I'll give an explanation about that. We'll get onto it. This is a book essentially about identity. It's about who we are, how we define ourselves, how we see ourselves as individuals, and how we see ourselves in relationship to the many groups each of us is a member of. It's about that particular relationship. And I realized with the Brexit vote in Britain that my central identity in terms of nationality is as a European. I feel intensely European. Those of you who've read the book, and I know it's only just out in Sweden, so that'll be very few of you, will understand that with my own family background, with the person that I'm married to and roots across much of Europe, Jewish Europe, Catholic Europe, it's a complex situation, but I realize that my center of gravity in terms of identity is I feel intensely European. But I have two nationalities, which is British and French. And I have always identified myself because I've lived mostly, I mean exclusively, in Britain, although I spent a lot of time in France, as British and French, Anglo-French. And I realized that with Brexit, I needed to find a way to reinforce for myself, I did it only for me, my sense of European connection. And so I did nothing more than invert the Anglo-French to Franco-British. But it's amazing how many people have noticed it.
Well, welcome.
Thank you.
Last time we met, it was 6 months ago, something like that. We were actually in the Ukraine, in Lviv. And it was a big PEN conference, and you held a lecture, the opening lecture, in Lviv University, in the big hall of Lviv University. And it was an amazing experience, not only to hear you, but that it took place in this very room. Because in that very same room, as you tell in your book, Hans Frank, the German Nazi lawyer, should we call him that, or what is his title?
He was an individual.
Yeah, well, he was the highest ranking Nazi
Yeah.
in the general government as the occupied Poland. He held a speech. You were actually standing in practically the same spot as he was in 1942. And you also showed us in the audience this photo of him there. And the timelines, it blew my mind sitting there. It was terrifying, actually, because what Hans Frank does at this speech in 1942 is that he declares the solution of the Jewish question in this area, in the general government. And so this actually was once in a lifetime for me.
And for me.
Yeah.
Maybe I should explain how I ended up standing there.
Please do.
In this curious spot, in this curious room, in this curious city. This was not a book I ever intended to write. In the spring of 2010, I received an invitation by email to deliver a lecture on the work that I do on crimes against humanity and genocide. Crimes against humanity is essentially about the protection of human beings as individuals. Genocide is about the protection of human beings in their capacity as members of a group. Crimes against humanity protects us as individuals. Genocide protects us as members of a group and a cultural community or a community. Would I come and give a lecture on the cases I'd done, on the academic work I'd done, on Nuremberg and the related matters? I said absolutely, I would be honoured and delighted to come. But the reality was I didn't accept because I had a burning desire to give a lecture in the city of Lviv, which is also Lemberg, which is also Lvov, and also Leopolis. It's all the same place. But I wanted to visit the city because it happened to be the city where my grandfather was born on my mother's side in 1904. And I thought that would be interesting to find the house where my grandfather was born. And the reason it would be interesting is my grandfather had never talked literally once to me about his relationship to that region and to that city. I understood because it was too painful. He had lost basically every member of his family from the place of his origin. So I knew him, he lived until 1998. I knew him incredibly well. We were incredibly close. But I knew, and my brother knew, you just don't talk about that period. So I thought, I'll go. I accepted. I spent part of the summer preparing the lecture on my work, and I was astonished to make two discoveries, truly astonished. The first discovery was that the man who invented the concept of crimes against humanity in international law, a man called Hirsch Lauterpacht, came from Lviv, studied at the law school that had invited me, and nobody there knew about it. So I thought, that's pretty amazing. I'll turn up and I'll tell them they are the origins. I carried on, and then I discovered that the man who invented the concept of genocide, and we'll come on to it, the work started here in Stockholm, unbelievably, it's another little-known story, also studied in Lviv, was also a student at the law faculty in Lemberg, Lvov, and they didn't know about that either. His name was Raphael Lemkin. I thought, how unbelievable is that? That they invite me to give this lecture, and they, the city, is the origin of these two concepts, both of which were coined in 1945 at the same moment, shortly before the Nuremberg trial. So I turned up there. A few weeks later, started writing about the three men, my grandfather Leon, a very personal story, a family story, and the big historical story, how crimes against humanity and genocide were invented by these two men, and the relationship between the three in this remarkable city. And then into the story came a fourth man. As I immersed myself in the research, I learned that Hans Frank, who was another lawyer, and not just any lawyer, he was Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer from 1928 to 1933, and was then appointed later as Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland, had arrived in the city in August 1942 to celebrate the first anniversary of its incorporation into his general government after the Hitler attacked the Soviets in the summer of 41 and captured the territory of Galicia. And so he turns up in Lemberg, as it is once again called, having been incorporated, if you like, into the government general and controlled by the Reich. And he is invited to give a big lecture in the hall that we were in. Today it's the aula of the university. It used to be the debating chamber of the parliament when Lemberg was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I found myself standing last September in the exact same spot where exactly to the month, 75 years earlier, Hans Frank announced rather publicly the implementation of the final solution and the extermination of the city and region's entire community of Jews. We're talking about 500,000 people who were killed in the space of the next months. And there was a moment, you remember, in the lecture where I put up on a giant screen the photograph of Hans Frank standing where I was standing exactly 75 years earlier. And like here, the lighting was such that I couldn't really see, I can't even see the front row, but I could there see the front row, which was full of the dignitaries, the mayor of Lviv, the members of parliament, the politically important people, the upper echelons. And they all were looking at me because they didn't know what had happened in this room. They did not know in 2017 that in this room, this man had come and done what he had done. It was one of those totally astonishing moments for, I think, everyone in the room, myself included.
It was indescribable, actually. And, well, you, in your book and in your lecture, you talk about these two men, and I'll just stay there, the Hirsch Lauterpacht, as you say, and Raphael Lemkin. We'll get back to everything, I think. We'll go in circles, but
there's a lot of detail.
Yeah, but I'll just stay with these two men because there's such a core in this book, and in your work, I suppose. Two crimes. They come up with two crimes. It's two mindsets. Two men who come to live very different lives. And they also, when they create these two separate crimes, they come up with two completely different conclusions, different moral conclusions and different legal conclusions. If we could just stay there for a while.
Sure. So just a word on each. So Lauterpacht, born in 1897 in the small town of Zhulkiev, which I discover as I do the research happens to be not only the same town, but he's born on the very same street as my great-grandmother, which I only discovered at the end of the research, which is extraordinarily personal for me because my first teacher of international law, and some of you here in the room will know him, was Eli Lauterpacht, the only child of Hirsch Lauterpacht. And Eli got me my first job in academia in 1984, and it was only 30 years later, in about 2014, that we learned that we could trace our roots to not only the same region, not only the same town, but the very same street, a few hundred meters apart. And I thought that was remarkable. And that is East-West Street, which is the title of the book. Lauterpacht moves from there to Lviv. He goes to the university, goes to the law school, and I think it's fair to say he is, for me, the greatest international lawyer of the 20th century. He's basically the key originator of the idea that under international law, each and every one of us in this room has rights under international law as individual human beings. That is the heart of the concept of human rights in modern international law. And his book, published in 1945, The Bill of International Rights of Man, was the first real academic work that focused on that idea. Lauterpacht has the fundamental belief that each and every one of us, simply because we are human beings, have minimum rights under international law. And that, in 1945, was an absolutely revolutionary idea, because up until that point, states under international law could treat their citizens as they wished, including killing them if they wanted to do that. So he makes the connection between the protection of individuals in what he calls rights, generally, into their protection as crimes against humanity. At the very same time, in parallel, but totally distinctly, because the two men never meet, astonishingly, Raphael Lemkin says, yeah, well, that's all very interesting, but actually, people don't get killed and abused because of their individual actions or qualities. they get killed and abused because they are members of a group that happens to be hated at a particular moment in time or place. So if you want to protect human beings, you protect not only individuals, you protect the groups of which they form a member. And so the two ideas go in parallel. And as I'm describing this, I know from previous conversations, and I'm sure this fine audience won't be any different, that is an issue that touches each of us, because each of us goes through the exercise of asking ourselves the question, okay, actually, who am I? How do I define myself? And how do I wish to be protected? And right now, that delicate balance between the protection of the individual and the protection of the group is back in issue as a central question of identity in modern politics with the rise of nationalism and xenophobia and populism. What is the relationship between the group and the individual? And I realize only now, I didn't realize it as I was writing the book, that the debate between Lauterpacht and Lemkin is essentially a debate about the nature of human identity and existence. So it goes much deeper than I had imagined. And what for me is striking, having now traced the story not only to these two men, but beyond. I'm a teacher in the classroom at a university, so I wanted to know who taught these men. How did they get these ideas from? How come two young men in their early 20s from Lviv, Lemberg, would both come up with these ideas? What happened in Lemberg? What happened in Lviv to give rise to these ideas? And so I would do things like, okay, let's find their student records. Let's find out what actually influenced them. And I, amazingly, with the help of two wonderful, wonderful young Ukrainian PhD students, found in the bowels of the city archives documents that had not been opened for decades, the student records of Lauterpacht and Lemkin. And we could identify all the courses they took, all the teachers they had, cross-refer, compare, and one teacher emerges as the catalyst for these ideas, a Polish professor of criminal law called Juliusz Makarewicz. And then I go beyond that, I find Makarewicz's classroom, you stand in the classroom, and you can imagine in 1918 and 1921, Makarewicz teaching these two young men from which they develop their own ideas. Two very different men, intellectually, socially, culturally, probably politically. And the book is a sort of constant internal struggle for me. Who am I with? Am I more with Lauterpacht? Am I more with Lemkin? I know if I had to choose one to have dinner with, it would be Lemkin. He was an absolute pain, I suspect.
Yeah, probably.
Drove people
terrible.
insane.
Yeah.
But probably over the dinner table would be the more entertaining person. But intellectually, I'm undoubtedly more with Lauterpacht, except that in the writing of the book, as I describe it, I increasingly, right up until the culmination of the book, find myself connected to Lemkin's essential truth, which is complex and simple at the same time. Complex in its consequence, but very simple to articulate. By the end of 7 years of writing this book, I understood the essential truth of what Lemkin was saying. It is impossible for me, and probably for any of us, to discard entirely or even significantly that sense of kinship we feel with some of the groups of which we happen to be a member. And that Lemkin touched on that essential truth. And it's impossible to get away from that.
But there's also the aspect of identity. A group identity is not always what you choose yourself. It's what the environment subjects on you, tells you that you are. This is the experience of so many Jews who thought they were like anyone else, and then suddenly realized that they were part of a group that was
But I
condemned
realized,
to death. So this is a double
Yeah, but I realized something else, and I only realized it after the book had been written. And the book's now coming out, I think, in about 20 different languages. And I've gone around different parts of the world, and I was very surprised to see that the book resonated as much in South Africa, in Mexico, in Argentina, in Bangladesh, in India. And I realized that this is not a book about Germans and Jews and Poles and Ukrainians. It's a book about all of us. Because the moment you take the conduit of the German and the Jew, you're actually also talking about, in South Africa, the black and the white, or the person on the right and the person on the left in an Argentine or Chilean context, or in Mexico, a different set of relationships. Or in Lebanon today, the question of the relationship between the Muslim and the Christian. There is a universality to the issues that I think transcends any one or more groups in relation to these issues. And if you go into the writings of Lauterpacht and Lemkin, you'll see that they were not at all concerned with any particular group or any particular individual. That sort of linked them. And this becomes most clear when you get, if you like, to the next stage of the historical part of the story, which is that remarkably, Lauterpacht and Lemkin are both hired to act on the prosecution at Nuremberg. Lauterpacht is hired by the British to push for crimes against humanity. Lemkin is hired by the Americans to push for the crime of genocide, sort of. And they find themselves in this extraordinary situation. They find themselves both, but separately, prosecuting Hans Frank. And when the trial opens on the 20th of November 1945, they do not know that the man they are prosecuting is the man who is directly responsible for the deaths of their parents and their entire families. They only learn that at the end of the trial in the summer of 1946, at which point, whoa. And that really touches me because I spend a lot of time in courtrooms, and I have spent a lot of time trying to imagine how it must have been for both Lauterpacht and Lemkin to find themselves in the presence of the man who was most directly connected to the deaths of their entire families. And that takes the book into a different direction. It, at that point, becomes a courtroom story about the lives of three men in a courtroom, in a single trial, two prosecutors, and a defendant struggling basically to save his life.
And Frank was also responsible for what happened to your family, your grandfather's family.
Sure. Mm. Frank becomes the glue between the three men because Frank, through his actions in the room that you were in and other actions, becomes responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, including the deaths of my grandfather Leon Bochholz's whole family, with one exception I've only just discovered now since the book came out, because out of the blue someone got in touch and said, actually there was one survivor, which we didn't know about. I can talk a little bit more about that. Lauterpacht's entire family, except for his niece Inka Katz, who's the only survivor, and Lemkin's entire family, except for his brother. And that made me very interested in Frank. And of course, there's an easy book to write on Frank the monster, but I didn't want to write that book. I mean, Frank was a remarkable person in many ways. Frank was a highly sophisticated lawyer, a very cultured man, a superb pianist, a personal friend of Richard Strauss, who in 1943 wrote a song in his honor. And it made me want to understand how someone who could be in this room this evening could be involved in the murder with which he was charged and eventually convicted of 4 million human beings. So I did what I would do in the courtroom. when I'm doing a case, I read everything I can find. With my research assistants and my juniors, we just gather everything that we can find. And I found in particular one book that was particularly helpful. And it was a book written by Hans Frank's youngest child, Nicholas Frank, who had been a journalist at Stern, the foreign editor of Stern in Germany, very distinguished journalist. And he wrote a book that was published in 1988 in Germany called Der Vater, the Father, published in a truncated version in English 4 years later. I sort of struggled through the German, then read the English. And it is possibly the most vicious book written by a child about one of their parents that I have ever read, or possibly that has ever been written. A book of utter hatred from a son to a father. And I thought, I'd like to meet this person. And I eventually tracked Nicholas down in 2011, and we spent hours and hours and hours together over extended periods of time. And we've now become very, very close friends. And I've understood aspects of his father's life from talking to him, from seeing the private correspondence. I mean, to give you a sense, if I can give one anecdote, of the kind of man Hans Frank was. And the book is full of anecdotes like this. Imagine it's 1942, it's the summer. Frank, just before he comes to Lemberg, receives a letter out of the blue. I mean, I'm telling you this story because a lot of people ask me the question, why did Frank do what he did? It's a question that is basically unanswerable, but we try to imagine how someone can do what he did. He receives a letter in June 42 from a childhood sweetheart of his, Lily Grau, actually the young woman he wanted to marry, but whose parents thought, rightly as it turned out, he was not good enough for their beloved daughter. And they said no. And so she drifted in a different direction. 20 years later, she writes to him and says, "My dear Hans, my son has been lost on the Eastern Front. You are a powerful man. Could you help find my daughter, my son?" He says, absolutely. And since we're in touch, why don't we meet up in Munich? And they meet up in Munich. They have a stonking great affair. He falls in love with her again and decides, summer of 42, this is the moment to divorce his wife and go back to wonderful Lily Grau. So he has to think of a reason for getting rid of his wife. And he invents what is probably the worst reason imaginable. He writes, I've seen it in the letters, Nicholas has shown me, to Brigitte Frank, my darling Brigitte, I am about to become involved in something that is so terrible that it would be better for you and our beloved children if you were to distance yourself from me so you are not tainted by what I'm about to get involved in. What's he referring to? He's referring to the Wannsee Conference and the final solution. Unbelievable. He's using the mass murder of millions of people to get a divorce, to satisfy certain needs that he feels. What does Brigitte do? She says, no. No. No divorce for you, my darling Hans. And she gets in touch with the Führer. I kid you not, I've seen it all in black and white, the actual letters, the diaries, and says to Adolf Hitler, stop my husband from divorcing me, and Hitler delivers. In the middle of the war, Hitler gets Martin Bormann to write a letter to Frank saying, no divorce until the end of the war, and the war has been won. Why do I tell you this story? I tell you this story because it offers an insight into the human mind, or the mind of Hans Frank, at a particular moment that helps you to understand, I think, the madness in which people were enveloped at that particular moment. And it is those tiny points of detail, I think, that begin to help us to understand why people like Hans Frank did what they did.
Yeah. It's an unbelievable portrait of him and his wife, and then you also involve his son in the book. I think we'll get to that in a little while. I just wanted to back a bit to go on and talk a bit about Lauterpacht and Lemkin, because I think it's interesting. I've read a bit and written a bit about Lemkin, and he, of course, as I understand it, or maybe it's him building a myth about himself, I'm not sure, but he begins with this thought about the group and group identity, especially when he follows the trial of a young student who killed the man who ordered the murders of the Armenian people. And so it's quite clear that it's long before the Nazi ideology even was a political factor. But it's still so interesting why they go these separate ways, because they both actually want to do the same, don't they?
They want to protect human beings.
Yes, they want to make the world better, a better place.
They do. The thing about there's many things about Lemkin. They're both very complex men. And it's, again, the tiny points of detail that is so attractive about them. So there's one image I have of Lauterpacht, who became, the path that he trod is astonishing. He starts in what is now the Ukraine. He moves to Vienna in 1919, studies with Hans Kelsen, goes to the London School of Economics in 1923, becomes professor of international law at Cambridge University in 1937, fellow of Trinity College, works with the British at Nuremberg, then ends up being the British judge at the International Court of Justice. So a remarkable career path. And yet he constantly sees himself as the outsider. And it's these tiny little anecdotes. And if you have been to Cambridge University, will know that the colleges have squares with grass in the middle of them. And the students are not allowed to walk on the grass. The fellows are allowed to walk on the grass. Lauterpacht would walk, when it was pouring with rain, would walk along the grass on his sort of tippity toes, so that his shoes didn't get all wet. Why is that telling? Because a normal person who feels comfortable about their place in society would walk round the sodden wet grass on the path, and he's walking across the grass basically to send a signal. I'm allowed to walk on this grass, even though it is a totally stupid thing to do, because my shoes and socks are going to get absolutely soaked. And it explains, I think, in a sense, Lauterpacht, the outsider. Lemkin, on the other hand, you have to treat everything he writes with a degree of caution, because he is a serial teller of what in the East End of London are called porky pies. A porky pie is a little lie. And I can give you an example of the kind of porky pie that Lemkin told. In 1933, he claims to have invented the new crime of barbarity and vandalism, which is the predecessor to genocide. But actually, he sort of partly nicked it from another academic called V.V.V. Peller, and doesn't give Peller full credit. But anyway, he then spends the next 10 years describing how, including at a big lecture he gives when he arrives at the United States, fresh from Stockholm in 1941.
Right. I'd forgotten this detail about you.
He describes to a huge audience in the United States how he had invented the concept of barbarity and vandalism. There was a big League of Nations conference in October 1933 in Madrid, and he had delivered a paper at the Madrid conference on his ideas on barbarity and vandalism. And so appalled were the German representatives that they walked out of the room in his presence as he spoke. There is a problem with this story. Lemkin wasn't in Madrid. He was originally going to be on the Polish delegation to attend the conference, but then Hitler assumed power. The Polish government sort of cozied up a bit with the Germans, and they thought, oh, we don't want this troublesome Polish Jew on our delegation. We'll take him off the delegation. And he has to send his paper in without attending the conference. So you learn, or I learned from a number of discoveries of what one might call Lemkin's tendency to embellish his own achievements and ideas, that the essential truth is correct, but the details are sometimes not entirely accurate. And yet it makes me love him even more, because he's a very lonely, solitary person.
Yes. And you feel a tenderness towards his fate and towards his person as well. And of course his fate is unbearable when you come to think of it. Very lonely, very poor, and finally dies of exhaustion at a bus stop, only 59 years of age. So.
In New York?
In New York, exactly.
He's completely obsessed. He becomes completely obsessed with the concept of genocide. He devotes the rest of his life to the concept of genocide. He introduces it into the Nuremberg trial. It's because of him. It then falls out of the trial. He puts it back. He rushes over to Nuremberg, gets it back into the trial. And then when the judgment at Nuremberg on September the 30th and October the 1st, 1946 comes down and makes not a single mention of the word genocide, he describes it as the blackest day of his life, worse even than the day he learned that his beloved mother and father had been killed. What does he do? He does not lie in a corner, crawl up and weep. He takes himself to Lake Placid, he gets into the first General Assembly of the United Nations, and he drafts and then gets adopted a resolution at the first meeting of the United Nations General Assembly that basically says the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg was wrong, genocide is a crime under international law. And 2 years later, the convention that he essentially drafts with the help of a small number of people, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, becomes the first multilateral modern human rights convention of our times, adopted in December 1948, the day before the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which is non-binding and which is influenced by Lauterpacht's book of 1945. So these two lives are just going in a sort of remarkable parallel.
And actually Lauterpacht's crime is the reason the declaration is just a declaration and not a binding document, isn't it? Because they connect the two together.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think maybe this is also a moment just to remind everyone, because you won't know, that in 1933 Lemkin invents these concepts takes these concepts of barbarity and vandalism. Then in 1939 he has to flee Poland because the Germans have taken over, and he makes his way here to Stockholm. And he spends a year in Stockholm. He arrives and cannot speak a single word of Swedish. Within 6 months, his Swedish is fluent, to the point that he could teach a course on Swedish commercial law at the law school here. I think that is incredible. And he writes a book.
Yeah, well, he collects research material on the KB, Kungliga, the Royal Library.
Well, that's a separate project. Yeah. And at the same time, while he's learning Swedish, while he's teaching a course on commercial law of Sweden, which I think very few people in this room, including me, could cope with, and writing a book, he does something else. He befriends someone or some persons in a large Swedish company, and this is one of the great mysteries of the book. We've never found out which Swedish company this person worked for, and asked that person to ask his company, which had offices all over Europe, to send to him in Stockholm all of the Nazi decrees that have been adopted in occupied territories, and he will then analyze them to see if there's a pattern of behavior. After a year in Stockholm, he leaves for the United States. He gets a job as a visiting professor at Duke University, and he goes the long route via the Soviet Union, via the Pacific, and he travels with huge quantities of luggage, simply suitcases filled with thousands and thousands of decrees that he has basically stolen from the library here in Stockholm, and that this unknown Swedish company has given him. He arrives in North Carolina. He spends 2 years analyzing the decrees, gets a contract for the Carnegie Foundation to publish a book, and in November 44, publishes Axis Rule on the basis of all these decrees, the first ever analysis. Chapter 9 of the book is called Genocide, and it's the word that he's invented. So the connection with this city is why one of the reasons I'm so pleased to be here is the book is so connected to this city, is the experience that he lives in this remarkable city.
And there are one or two of us here, I think, in this very room who have thought several times about how we should honor Lemkin in Stockholm, and we'll think of a good way. And
he really should be. He really, I mean, this is part of his culture. He spent an incredibly important year
and
here.
a part of the genocide concept story. There are a lot of questions and things here we're not getting to. I just realized time is, as it is, running away. It's fine. I thought we'd just mention what you do in this book, because there are several layers. There's this first layer of the 3 men connected to Lviv at first hand, Lauterpacht, Lemkin, and your grandfather. That's sort of the first level. And then you go, there's another level where you go into Hans Frank and his son Niklas. And then there's another son of a high-ranking Nazi that you also bring into the story. And their different ways of dealing with their father's crimes. Completely different in their way of approaching what their father are responsible for. You've made friends with both of these men. The one takes responsibility for his father's actions in denouncing them and his father, and the other one, how would you describe him?
Dear Horst.
Horst, yes, Wächter. He's the son of now I want to guess Otto Wächter. Just very briefly, because it's so interesting, which one of these 2 sons, now elderly men or something like that, which one have chosen the easiest path, do you think?
So Otto Wächter was Hans Frank's deputy. Governor first of Krakow, responsible for constructing the Krakow ghetto, then governor of Galicia and Lemberg. At the moment, the final solution is implemented and is indicted for mass murder, but manages to escape. I'm actually right now writing the sequel to this book, which is the story of what happened to Wächter, who ends up protected and living in the Vatican. He hides for 3.5 years in the mountains above 2,000 meters, and then makes his way in the spring of 49 onto what is called the Rat Line to get to Argentina. And Horst, his son, who I've also befriended, has given me the entire correspondence of his mother and father in that period, which is, we believe, the first example of an entire account of escape and effort to get abroad, and the assistance given by a remarkable group of people who are in code. We've spent 3.5 years decoding it. But the point for Horst is that his father was never condemned, and therefore his father is an innocent man, and his father is therefore a good and decent man. And so you have these 2 sons who have very different perspectives. I would say, so you have Nicholas, who hates his father and condemns him 150,000%, and Horst, who loves his dad and thinks he's a great bloke. Horst has the easier life. There's no question. Horst wakes up in the morning, the happier person. And there are lots of levels of complexity to understanding how one deals with these issues. I mean, I grew up in a family which was, if you like, on the receiving end of what had happened in that period. So I grew up with that perspective. And it's been, in a sense, a real privilege to get to know Nicholas and Horst, to see what it means to be on the other side. And it's difficult. It's incredibly difficult. I mean, when Nicholas tells me the stories of being a 7-year-old child in the playground at school where his friends are laughing at him because that week his father is going to be hanged at Nuremberg. And I imagine the life of a 7-year-old child and the effect that has on a 7-year-old child to be on the receiving end of that kind of bullying from your schoolmates. It's a huge thing to imagine going through. And Horst also, in different ways, what it means to grow up in a family with a notorious Austrian name, the burden borne by that family continues to this day. I have no doubt about that. And that's why I feel a lot of empathy, because neither of these two men are responsible for what their fathers did. I mean, at the heart of my reaction to them is an aspect of the book that we haven't touched on, a very complex set of family secrets. Because one part of the detective story in the book is my uncovering what happened to my own family in Vienna in 1939. My grandfather, my grandmother, and my mother, who was 1 year old. I had always thought growing up, and indeed until I started research on this, that they had left Vienna together for Paris in 1939 after the Anschluss, after the Nazis took over in Austria. And it was only in preparing the lecture to go to Lviv that my mother gave me a whole set of papers I'd never seen before, including their passports. And from those passports, I was able to work out very quickly that they had left separately. My grandfather left in January 1939 for Paris. My mother followed in July 1939 by herself, aged 1, and my grandmother stayed behind. And it was something the family did not wish to talk about. We did not know what had happened. We knew as kids, my brother and I, you just don't go there, you just don't ask questions. So we didn't. And now I thought, okay, let me see if I can find out what happened. And I had to find out, really, what caused my grandfather to leave by himself. How did my mother get from Paris to Vienna by herself, aged 1? And why did my grandmother stay behind? The big question for anyone who is a parent, as I am, and many of you in the audience are, and particularly I think for a mother, is how the mother of a 1-year-old child could bear to be separated from their 1-year-old child. And so I began to explore this aspect and was pretty surprised to find out that with the passage of 70 years, it is possible to identify answers to these stories and to uncover the identities of your grandparents' lovers, which was very unexpected. So aside from the big political story and the historical story is a deeply personal story which raises the most profound questions for me about what rights do I have as a son and as a grandson to write about these things, which is one of the reasons it was so slow in the writing, because these were very complex issues that I needed to sort out before I could open those doors.
All right, if we had another hour, I would go in that direction now. But we have to conclude in order to let at least some questions from the audience in. But I'd like to conclude with, very briefly, did Lauterpacht's and Lemkin's work make the world better? A better place?
Yes, it did. It did. I mean, it didn't make the world a better place, a perfect place. I'm not starry-eyed about international law. I'm an international lawyer. I know the realities of the world. There are other people here in this room who know the realities of the world even better than I do, have much longer experience. What I tell my students is that international law and the system of the rule of law and the striving for international justice is a long game. Something remarkable happened in 1945. You've written a remarkable book about 2 years later, which I think took that story forward. You've written about 1947, an extraordinary book. In 1945, for the first time, states came together and said, the state is no longer absolutely sovereign. There are limits on what the state can do in relation to its own nationals. And those limits were informed in part by the work of Lauterpacht and Lemkin, and indirectly, it has to be said, by the work of Hans Frank. You cannot expect, after millennia of absolute sovereignty, for countries to suddenly keel over and say, oh, okay, that's it, game's over, we can't anymore, we're subject to all these constraints. It's going to be a long struggle. Brexit, Make America Great Again, issues with the EU, issues with trade. I mean, it's all part of that backlash. I taught for a number of years at Cambridge University, and I had a wonderful colleague at St. Catherine's College who was the professor of English legal history, Sir John Baker, wonderful scholar of medieval English history. And I remember I'd sometimes have lunch with him in college, and I would describe to him some aspect of international law that I was dealing with, and John would say, yes, Philippe, yes. We had the same problem in English law in 1464, and it took 322 years. And I think that's international law. It's a long game. It's not going to be sorted out tomorrow. It's not because you adopt a convention on genocide or a declaration on, human rights or civil and political rights that all of a sudden states will start behaving and human beings will start behaving as they should behave. So 2 steps forward, 1 step sideways, 1 step back, another step forward, another step sideways. It's just a long game, and we are just at the beginning. And in essence, the story of Lauterpacht and Lemkin captures a particular moment. There are other moments, of course. I'm not saying it's the only moment or theirs is the most important. Absolutely not. But it captures a particular moment of change, which is right now under threat, although I'm pretty comfortable that whatever happens in the next few years, the trajectory is the trajectory that was started in 45, and the acquis that we have will, over the long term, be maintained and strengthened. But in the meantime, we will have the killings of the Yazidis, we will have Guantanamo, we will have the Rohingya in Myanmar, we will have the horrors of Syria and refugees. It's a long game.
Well, I'll just conclude with the fact that we're actually 2 pen presidents here on the scene, and I wonder if that is a coincidence. I don't think it is. I think we both have the family histories we have, and that, do you agree, that makes us more open to these questions, to trying to make?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, how...
Or do you think it is?
I mean, I think every person in this room is informed by their personal experiences. We take the paths we take and adopt the directions we adopt, at least in part, because of the community we've grown up in, because of our parents, because of our friends, because of a single school teacher, because of the groups we are members of, because of the experiences that are passed down across the generations.
But still, it's a trauma, I think, that has sort of followed us to this place. Isn't that right? And maybe the people in this room as well, interested in these questions.
I'd say an experience. You know, I got very interested in this. The book begins. The most important quote in this book is not my quote in any way at all. I got very interested in how it was that I had somehow reached out to understand my grandfather's story. And I turned, because I was not expert in it, to people I thought might have a sense of the relationship between a grandparent and a grandchild. It's a roundabout way of touching on what you've asked. And I asked 2 psychoanalysts whether they could direct me to the work of the relationship between grandparent and grandchild. Not parent and child, which I knew a bit about, but grandparent and grandchild. And I was directed by both psychoanalysts to the remarkable work of two Hungarian psychoanalysts, Maria Torok and Nicholas Abraham, who developed a theory in the 1960s, which they called the crypt, that when a person goes through a hugely traumatic experience, there is a desire and a tendency to shut that experience in a crypt, deep inside our psyche, shut the door, lock it, throw away the key, not talk about it, and hope it'll go away. You move on. You move to the future. Torok and Abraham developed a thesis, a sort of Freudian thesis, that the crypt isn't really shut. That what happens is the experience that the grandparent has gone through is communicated in some way, not to the next generation, but to the next generation but one. And that there is a way in which grandparent and grandchild communicate, which is different from parent and child. I have to say, from my own relationship with my grandfather in particular, that resonated with me, and looking at my own children's relationship with their grandparents, with my mother in particular, that resonates. And the book begins with a quote that I think encapsulates the answer to your question. But I think it's a universal. What haunts are not the dead, but the gaps left within us by the secrets of others. Those secrets are communicated by means we do not understand, and they inform our actions. I feel that is right in explaining the extent to which my grandfather communicated things to me by ways I do not understand, which enabled me or committed me to touch on certain issues. And that thesis may be right or it may be wrong, but for me at least, it resonated to explain why I'm sitting here talking about these subjects, given the life that I've had. So I don't feel like a traumatized person at all, as I hope you can tell. I'm actually a rather optimistic person. But I understand that my actions and directions are informed by things that I don't fully know and cannot fully explain.
That's the last words from us.
Yeah.
Thank you, Philippe Sands. Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliantly ending.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have to ask the arrangers, the people, do we have time for 2 questions, or should we just, Yes, we have. All right. Are there, well, I'll limit it to 2 questions, so this will be a hard competition. Do we have any questions? It's so difficult to see you. I'm sorry. Yes, here we have someone. Brief, focused question, please.
Philippe, Elizabeth, thank you so much. My heart's in my throat. My name is Julie Lindahl. And I was going to read the same quote that Philippe, you just read, because I have a family history which left a gap in me. My grandparents were among the perpetrators. And really, I think since you brought up this quote, I won't go back to it, but one of the things you raised, question you raised that you didn't answer is one I'd like to ask you again, which is about whether we, as grandchildren and children, have the right, what right we have to look back and comment on our grandparents' past, particularly in relation to this history, because this is a problem that I ran into in researching my own family's past. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie, and it's very nice to see you, even though in the dim past, because you wrote to me and we've had a very nice exchange. I mean, I think there's no right or wrong answer. I think it's for each person in each family context. I mean, we are all in our families. Every family has secrets. Every family has stories, and the question of how to touch those or not touch them is very delicate, and I'm not saying to anyone what they should or should not do. I can only talk about my own situation, which was that I came across facts that raised a question about the paternity of my mother. I found the identity of my grandmother's lover in Vienna in 1939. And from that, I then went on to identify, write to, and meet the grandchildren of my grandmother's lover. And at one point, the granddaughter of my grandmother's lover said, "Let's do a DNA test."
This is in the book.
It's all in the book.
So
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
say anything more.
Yeah, I'll only say this.
Cliffhanger.
No, but
Cliffhanger.
what I'll say is this. In deciding how to proceed, because I'm very committed to the idea of transparency and openness, I knew I didn't want to open that door unless I could write about it. And I could only write about it if I could write about everything that then transpired. And so the question was, homing in, what right did I, as a son, have to impose upon my mother information that I could cope with as a grandchild, but may be very different for her as the daughter of my grandfather. And that took a lot of thinking and a lot of talking with a lot of people. I ended up deciding that I would do it and I would write about it openly, and working out for myself how I would deal with my relationship with my mother, with whom I'm very close, who is alive and active and well, and who I love very much. And the last thing I would want to do is cause grief to my mother. But that encapsulated a process. What ended up happening, I won't give it all away, but what ended up happening was the granddaughter of the lover. So in the end I said yes, okay, let's do it. We got the kits. It was quite complex to work out how to do it. The kits arrived. One went to her house, one went to my house. She emailed me within 10 minutes of the kit arriving saying she's done it, she's sent it off, and looking forward to the results. I sat on it for 6 months. Just the box sort of sat there in the hallway at home. I couldn't work out what to do. I was sort of paralyzed. And I think there's no right answer. It's just so, for each of you, you're all people who think about these things. You work out for you what is the way you do it. But I think the heart of it is, don't do things without very careful reflection. I mean, these things just have huge consequences. And one has to really, really reflect about the consequences for others. But in writing this book, one very important thing happened. I was talking to my mother about it a few weeks ago, because for her it's been a big experience, that a whole set of family issues that were shrouded in darkness, now very much open to public scrutiny, but it's been a good experience for her overall. And I thanked her. I said to her, you know, when I was going to Lviv back in 2010, and I asked, are there any papers? You could have said no, there's nothing, and that would have been the end of the matter. That's not what happened. She said, there are. You've never seen them, I've never shown them to you, but I'm going to give them to you now. And she went into her bedroom, ruffled around, and came back with 2 very old, battered briefcases and said, here, they're yours. I don't want to know what you do with them, just do it. And it was a way of saying, I can't open this door, but I trust you to open this door. Do it sensitively, do it carefully, think about me, think about others. But that was a very important signal. And she could have withheld that and I would not then have written a book.
And it was
it's
a
a
blessing.
huge question.
It was a blessing.
Yeah.
Somehow you had her.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what's really important for her, the most important thing for her, is that having had my mum, as you'll see from the book, was a hidden child. She had no contact with her parents for the first 5 years of her life after she went to Paris. She was hidden, saved by a series of Catholic families who hid her for 5 years in Paris. And she has no memory of the first 5 years of her life. And so that whole period is one that is shrouded in darkness, and we just don't talk about it. And one of the most wonderful thing of all for me about this book is that she has received the benefit of communications from people saying, what an amazing man your father was. And I think that is, for a son, the single finest thing you can hope for on a project like this, that she walks with a lighter step on a daily basis because of this project. Things she was scared of, things that were dark, turned out to be okay. Not perfect, but okay. And that has been an important thing. It's a good, fine question that you ask.
Thank you, Philippe. Thank you. And for anyone interested, Philippe will sign the book at the entrance. And that's all from us today. Big hand for Philippe Sands.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Also, a very big thank you from us here at Kulturhuset, and we actually have small gifts for you, Philip and Elizabeth.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Tack.
Thank you.
Tack ska ni ha, publiken.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Tack. And thank you.
Yeah.